Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. Today we'll be talking about studying archaeology in Germany versus Australia.
Hi, Ada. Thank you so much for being here today and sparing some of your free time for this. So, can you please tell us briefly about your education background? You studied in Australia and in Germany. How did it work?
Yeah, so I studied in Australia. First off, I was born in Turkey and then I grew up in Australia, so I'm not really an international student in Australia. I did a bachelor's of archaeology and then a bachelor's of archaeology with honours at La Trobe University in Melbourne. I then worked for a few years in Australia until I decided I wanted to continue with my studies, and so I came here to Tübingen to study masters in science, specifically in archaeological science, at the University of Tübingen.
Okay. I think that's a lot of education for one person. But like you said, you have studied in Australia
Yeah.
and you have studied here in Germany. How would you compare the educational system in these both countries?
So in Australia, I found that the education system was a lot more structured. In Australia, they told you what they wanted you to do to get your grades, to get to pass. They gave you specific instructions. And here in Germany, I found that it's a lot more. Uh, it's a bit left up to you. You're meant to kind of like guide your own way. You're meant to figure out what you need to do and how you're meant to do it, and then your teachers will tell you if you're doing it correctly or not. Although I guess it's important to point out that I was doing an undergraduate in Australia, and here I'm doing a master's, so the difference in system might be dependent on that. However, from what I've seen, it's here in Germany, there is less guidance and uh, more expectation that you as a student guide your own path.
Okay. Like you already mentioned, you were not exactly an international student in Australia, but you are here in Germany. But I'm sure you have seen a lot of people in Australia who are international students, and how would you comment on that? Like how the government or the university actually treat international students? I mean, how would you compare these two countries?
So I think first off, in Australia, there is a difference in the way the university treats people who are undergraduate international students and then graduate international students. So if you come to Australia to do a PhD, from the PhD students I've met, uh, they're treated a lot like employees, and you're come with the expectation that you're getting paid for your work, your lifestyle matches that kind of life like survivability in Australia. Uh, if you're an undergraduate student, it's a bit different. Within the university itself, you'll get a lot of support networks. You'll have a lot of groups that are going to reach out and want to help you. The government and for the universities, you're kind of treated more like you're providing money into the university system than anything else. They'll teach you, they'll work to the best of their ability to do so, but it's really from the kind of like in Australia as an international student, you really need to reach out to people to help establish a support network. And if you don't have that, it can be very difficult from what I've seen. But if you have that, it's all a fun time. By comparison to here in Germany, I mean, the university I went to was an international university, so my classes were all taught in English. But because of that, it was a bit bureaucratically nightmare to kind of deal with everything, and there was no guidance when you come here about how you're meant to accomplish anything, or how you're meant to find a place to live, or uh, people there to really help you adapt to the place. So my first few months here in Germany were difficult. Uh, but again, this is speaking from the perspective of someone
Yeah.
who's only been an international student in one country. I think in Australia, if you go in as a PhD student or a master's student, you're specifically a PhD student, you're treated quite well. You're treated as a researcher and someone who's there to accomplish important work. As an undergraduate student, you will need to find your place a lot more.
Okay. But how about the living expenses? I mean, if I'm a student in Australia and if I'm a student here, you also have to compare the living expenses. I mean, the groceries. How would you compare?
So in my final year of university in Australia, I lived out of home. and I had government assistance because I was an Australian citizen. But even then, in Australia, you want money, of course, and you're gonna want to find a job, and depending on the kind of international student you are, finding jobs are going to be easier or harder, depending on how well you speak English, of course, depending on who you know. There'll be a lot of people who try and exploit you if you're there on specific kinds of visas, so be careful of that. And the living standards in Australia are a lot higher. Uh, but of course, when I was living out of home in Australia, I was paying half the rent I pay here in Tübingen, and I was living in a giant house with a giant backyard with a fireplace, a big kitchen, and here I'm paying twice as much as I would have paid a monthly in Australia, and I have one bedroom in a small flat in the middle of the city so I preferred the living in Australia. The groceries compared to Tübingen are relatively the same. The rest of Germany, I've been told, is cheaper, so it's only the city I chose to study in that's pretty expensive for groceries compared to Australia. And Australia is, yeah, it's an expensive place. But if you find work, if you find if you find a job that isn't going to try and exploit you, you'll be able to pay your way through. Yeah.
Okay. Um, like you mentioned, the job opportunities. So this question is specifically about your own field in archaeology. How would you compare the job opportunities in Germany and in Australia? And please don't consider the language barrier. Other than that,
Yeah.
how would you compare the opportunities?
So I just finished my master's here in Germany, and I'm hoping to work a few months in archaeological work here. So from what I've seen and from the friends I've had here who have found archaeological work, it's not that difficult finding archaeological jobs. But that being said, I worked as an archaeologist in Australia for about 4 to 5 years before I came here to Germany, and I got my first archaeological job a year and a half before I finished my bachelor's. I was paid, I mean, my annual wage, if I worked, it was difficult. You basically had to own your own business, but you were hired by people to do jobs. And in a good year, I earned anywhere from $80,000 to $100,000. So I could go on holidays fairly regularly.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. And then here in Europe, the pay wage from the friends I've had who have worked in archaeological jobs, it's less than a fifth of what I used to earn in Australia. So, the living standard, I guess, it actually isn't as high as Australia, especially if you're looking to have a good life, like a big, like easygoing life. So you will be paid a wage from what I can see that will help you survive here in Germany. And getting a job is, well, the other thing about my field is that in this field, you're not going to really find a job by just applying to places to work. Every job I've gotten in archaeology, whether it's been here in Germany or back in Australia, it's always been about who you know and who you go to the pub with. And if they know someone, connections, yeah, networking. So, I mean, and this is true for, I guess, any job right now. If you want to find work in a field, you need to have an established connection with individuals. Actually, do you want to hear a fun story?
Yeah.
The first job so like I said, I got my first job in archaeology a year and a half before I actually graduated to my degree.
Okay.
The reason I got this job was because I joined an indoor soccer team with my laboratory, and through that, there was a guy who played indoor soccer with us who wasn't working for the university, but he was a long-term archaeologist. And then one day he's like, I really need some workers. Do you want a job? And I'm like, yes. And then basically through that 2 weeks of working with him, we became really close friends. He really liked how I worked. And from that point on, I've worked on like every job I've worked in Australia. Any site he was running, I would work with him. And then he got me really started in making a lot of connections to, yeah.
Okay.
And even here, the people I know, the jobs I'll get in archaeology is because I'm friends with a few people around who work for archaeological companies, and they will go and say, this person is easy to get along with. I know he'll work hard, and that's how you'll get a job. But that's my field. That might
So
not be
I
the
guess
case.
Guys, it's going to be hard for the introverts. So you're
I
going to make connections as soon as possible.
I like to think I'm an introvert as well, which is the funny thing. It's just sometimes it's not about being the most friendly person, but it's about being a good person. And when people get to know you, right, they will say this guy or this girl will work very hard, right?
But I guess it also depends which company are you hanging out with,
Yeah.
even if it's limited.
Yes. And sometimes companies have problems with one another. I can't if I started talking about all of the gossip in Australian archaeology, it would blow your mind. So you always had to like pick who you wanted to work with and who you wanted to be friends with. It was a bit political. And again, from what I've heard, Germany is not that different in the industry. They just pay a lot less.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much. I have just one last question.
Yeah.
So, when you moved here for the first time, how difficult was it for you uh, facing an entirely different language here?
So, that's a funny question because I came to Germany with the complete intention of learning German. I had studied some in high school. Yeah. Have I learnt any German? No, not that much. I can understand it fairly well. I can't speak it too well. For me, the big issue was I came to an international university. My department is very international. It's also very English based because archaeology academically is very English based. English or Spanish, and they're not really going to speak Spanish here in Germany. And especially archaeological sciences, a lot of the work is published in English, done in English. So the people I've interacted have always communicated primarily in English. And then the other issue was almost everyone in this city I found that doesn't speak English or speak English properly speaks Turkish, which I speak fluently. So
Okay.
I would go into a place and like they'd get frustrated if I couldn't speak German properly, and I'd just switch to Turkish.
Okay.
Um, and from that point on, they'd never try to speak German to me again. Every time they saw me, it would just be in Turkish. So I had troubles in learning German. I did not have troubles communicating with a lot. And all the bureaucracy was in English as well if you needed it. So if you could speak English, you could get away with a lot.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's true. So I think that's it for now. Thank you so much for being here
Anytime.
today. I'm sure all the students who wants to study archaeology in Germany or who wants to compare how does it work in Germany and in Australia, I hope this helps you. But if you have any questions, you can just write me and he will answer. I will make him answer.
Yeah.
So
Happy
until
to.
then, take care. Goodbye.